Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for inviting me to your celebration. It's indeed a great pleasure and a great honor to be with you and to share some thoughts on the enormous opportunities, but also enormous challenges that lie ahead. Let me, at the very onset, reiterate the size of the opportunity that we are talking here in India over the next 13 years until 2030. I think if we see this enormous growth of the Indian economy and the clear need for significant oil and gas resources, we're talking about $2 to $3.5 trillion of additional resources here in India, depending on whether the oil price is around $50 per barrel, then we have a $2 trillion opportunity. If it's around 85 to 90, it's a $3.5 trillion opportunity. And it's very important to put this into perspective. I mean, if you think that the Indian economy, the GDP per year is just $2.5 trillion. So we see the enormous opportunity and the enormous work that lies ahead for you over the next 13 years until 2013. I mean, these things don't come by themselves. The growth of the economy between 7% and 8% over the coming years, but also the growth of the oil and gas industry requires enormous efforts, your efforts. And so let me just start by providing a short overview and then talking more specifically about demand and supply, and then about the specific opportunities for the Indian companies for you. When we talk about the world economy, of course, there are lots of dark clouds on the horizon, and many people paint indeed a very pessimistic picture. Growth is down, there are lots of uncertainties, lots of risks. But I think what we should be clearly have in our minds is that in Asia Pacific, there is the greatest growth potential, and it's three regions. It's India, it's China, and it's Southeast Asia. And these are the three fastest growing regions in the world and will continue to grow in the coming years and decades. India between 7% and 8%, China between 6% and 7%, and Southeast Asia between 5% and 6%. That's an enormous potential. The developed world, North America, Europe, Japan, between 1% to 3%, and even emerging markets, Latin America, Africa, significantly, Middle East, significantly below the potential here in India, in China, and in Southeast Asia. And I think it's very important to keep this in mind, and there's no reason to be pessimistic, because in those three regions, we have more than 3 billion people with enormous ambitions, really trying to build a better future for themselves, for their children. And yes, life is not easy, but they will make it work. And of course, it also means that there is enormous need for energy, for oil and for gas, and also for new forms of energy, renewables. Already today, renewables have a total worth of $1.3 trillion. So in a huge industry, already a significant portion that tries to really find new ways of creating the supply. And I think it's very important, even though this is the Petroleum Industries Association, I think you will have to think very carefully about which parts of the not only supply chain, but also which parts of the energy industry you want to cover. So let me talk about demand and supply. Clearly, demand goes up. It goes up and it grows because of the growing demand in the emerging markets, especially here in India, in China, and Southeast Asia. Whereas in North America and Europe, Japan, it will stagnate and potentially slightly decline. And if we look at the per capita consumption of oil in India of around 700 kilograms, it's just a third of what we have in Brazil and less than a tenth of what we have in the US. And I would not recommend, that you go up to the usage in the US. I think neither the Indians would find this useful nor the rest of the world. And if you think that the highest sold car in the US is a big pickup, I think this is probably not the best way of doing it in India. That does not mean there will not be a lot more cars, and well deserved so, but it should probably not be pickups, large pickups. Neither in Europe do we can afford that. So I think what we will see is a massive increase of demand around the world, in particular in India also, and the additional opportunity is, as I said, around $2 trillion if we only talk about $50 per barrel of oil. And I think this demand has to be met either by domestic supply, and I hear it's slowly coming down. Even though, as we just heard from the previous speaker, there is still lots of opportunity to optimize and maybe get more out of the wells, become more efficient in yield and in supply, and also in automating and optimizing the usage. But overall, domestic supply should come down and imports will grow. And I think it's very important to really think about how to really make best use of this increasing demand, and also where to really get the supplies from. Talking about demand, there are two key segments which are crucial. One is transportation, which is slightly less than half of the usage and demand, and petrochemicals, which is slightly above. While of course we have heard a lot about how transportation will change, and we talk about Google, we talk about Uber, we talk about Tesla, and there's no doubt that overall vehicles will become much more efficient. There will be electric cars, there will be autonomous driving, there will be car sharing and so forth. We will see increased demand also for oil and gas in the transportation area. But because the world is changing fast, certainly North America and Europe, maybe not quite as fast in this respect here in India and Asia, we'll see a peak oil, not meaning peak supply, but peak demand. And BCG estimates that in the world at large, we will see peak demand in 2025 already, which is in some ways a good news. In other ways, it's tough news. It just means lots of things will change. But it certainly means that oil prices will remain under pressure for years to come. And depending on which side you are, you may think this is a good way, is a good thing, or not so good thing. Certainly, I think the government will have to pay less in terms of subsidies or no subsidies, which certainly is a very important opportunity. Now, talking about the petrochemical segment, here we see very strong growth, especially again in the emerging markets. And we forecast that growth in India will be, in petrochemicals, will be around 9%. Again, the global market continues to grow, not quite as strongly as in India, but certainly gets to a size of $750 billion a year globally. So a major opportunity, but again, really focusing a lot in India, China, Southeast Asia, and some other emerging markets. As the world population grows to around 9 billion by the year 2000, we'll see clearly an increase in demand. And so the question is, how do we meet this demand? We've seen enormous disruptions over the last several years. The shale revolution, especially from the US in oil and gas, has really brought massive disruptions. Technology has changed, and there is a lot more opportunity for productivity. And those innovations and the drive for efficiency have also been driving transitions from a coal and oil-based economy to more one driven by alternative fuels, including natural gas. I think one of the things which is also important to keep in mind that solar and wind are becoming very, very competitive. And the recent tenders in windcraft in Europe have led to prices of less than $0.04 per kilowatt hour. And I understand also here solar in India is slightly less now in terms of costs at $0.04 per kilowatt hour, which just shows, the tremendous opportunity that lies in alternative. And my colleagues at BCG who really focus on that really believe that we have not reached the end yet, and that alternative energy sources, windcraft and solar and others, will really increase much more rapidly than is expected or has been expected until, I would say, just the last couple of years. And I think it will be very important to keep in mind that together with nuclear and hydro energy, alternative energies will meet at least half of the additional energy use in the coming years and decades. And I think it's very important to keep this in mind as you think about your portfolio of activities. One of the key elements, of course, that we all need to focus on, and you will, I'm sure, focus on, as we see the increase in supply, is natural gas. Natural gas we expect to grow much, much faster than oil and coal, helped also by the rapid growth of LNG accessible across the globe. And there are massive investments all over the world to provide gas from Australia, here in Asia, of course, Africa, Latin America, and even the US is becoming a big player in this area, not to forget, of course, Russia. So what does it mean for the Indian companies, for you? You have very strong players here. You represent very strong players, both downstream and upstream. And increasingly, all of you are looking at the whole supply chain. So really adding activities when you are in upstream, in downstream, and vice versa. And there also have been some combinations over the recent past. I think it's very important to really think about the oil and gas sector as integrated sectors, to really think about upstream, midstream, downstream, to think about all the aspects and where to focus and how to make it best work. I think it will be a key challenge for all of you. Also to include bets on alternative energy, whether it's windcraft, whether it's solar, whether it's participating in charging stations for electrical vehicles, or maybe even think about participating in experiments on hydrogen fuel cells. The world is changing. I think it's very important to understand that nobody can foresee, not me nor any other experts, how the portfolio and how the different supplies and demand developments will play out. So it's very important to stay agile, both to have a broad portfolio of activities with which you are really making good use of the opportunities, but also, I think, within each activity to really try to optimize, both on the technology side, but also in combining activities with others, working together with specialists, maybe in alternative energy, just to have a good understanding of what's going on there, not necessarily owning everything, but having participations that gives you a good clue of what's going on. Let me remind you at the end again about this enormous opportunity. $2 to $3.5 trillion of additional resources needed cumulative over the next 13 years until 2013. Production here in India, more likely significant imports, but making very good use of those, finding the right sources, optimizing the mix, and then making sure that whatever you do, you are really at the forefront of developments. The future is not just happening. You make the future happen, and I'm sure you will do it well. I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.